All right, this video lecture is on 19th century imperialism, 19th century, 1800s. In particular, the so-called Scramble for Africa, as it's often termed. Before I launch into what happens in Africa, let me briefly allude to some other places on the globe in which there's colonies going on in the 1800s. The United States of America, contrary to its ideals and its traditions, actually becomes a colonial power at the end of this century. Cuba, which is one of the last Spanish colonies in the Americas, has had a long rebellion, an independence movement to try and free itself from Spanish control. And the Spanish, because Cuba was so profitable, it's a sugar island, fiercely resisted this independence movement and used some pretty harsh measures to try to put the rebellion down. This caught the attention of the United States, and through a series of newspaper articles, lots of pressure, an incident in which a United States warship blew up in Havana Harbor, the United States declared war on Spain. It's not a very long war, it's only a few months. Spain is totally outclassed when it comes to the military might of the United States of America. Spanish forces are defeated at sea in the Caribbean, on land on Cuba. American troops take over Cuba. And the other Spanish colony on the other side of the world that they still hold on to is the Philippines. And in a similar way, U.S. forces, although it's mostly naval forces, there's a huge naval battle, one-sided naval battle, in which the Spanish fleet is destroyed in the Pacific, and the United States takes over the Philippines. The United States will hold on to the Philippines until after World War II. In addition, the U.S. will acquire territories such as Guam and Puerto Rico, which the United States still administers as territories to this very day. Now, in addition to the British possessions, let me just quickly hit the high points of countries that Britain controls outside of Africa during the 1800s. Canada, of course, and then there's Australia and New Zealand. Australia was taken over by the British in the 1700s, not too long after it was first discovered by a European, and in a similar way, New Zealand. Both of these are colonies administered by Britain, but they will become independent of Britain after World War I. They'll both have a surge of nationalism, and they will peacefully ask to have independence, self-governance, but they remain part of the British Commonwealth to this very day. Canada, in a similar way, in the 1860s, will essentially ask Great Britain, may we please be more or less independent? And the British will say yes. It's a sharp contrast to the way that the 13 colonies achieved their independence during the American Revolutionary War. The British will have territory in the Far East, such as Hong Kong. They'll take over Malaysia and Burma. And their biggest prize is of course, India. But now let's return to Africa. Step one for poor Africa, in terms of being exploited by European powers, was, of course, the slave trade, lasting for several centuries, upwards of 10 to 12 million people taken from Africa and brought in bondage to the Americas. But step two, stage two, is when European powers begin to directly take over and control virtually all parts of the African continent. The only exception will be Ethiopia, which somewhat surprisingly will achieve its independence partially by virtue of the fact that it's highlands, it's a little bit isolated, but they actually are able to pull off the only military defeat in this whole era of a European power. Italy is going to try to claim Ethiopia, and the Ethiopians under a far-sighted monarch, are going to arm themselves, and they'll actually defeat Italian forces in a battle in the late 1800s. But the rest of Africa, every part of it, will become dominated by a European power. So you can see this outline map, and here are the various countries that have a claim in it. The British probably have the most and the most valuable territories. The French have extensive possessions, although a large part of it is desert. But they'll have Morocco and Algeria. Algeria is essentially going to become a part of France, occupied by Frenchmen, the same way that the English took over the 13 colonies. And they're going to have a long and bloody war over the independence of Algeria, which will not be resolved until the 1960s, when France finally lets go of Algeria. The Portuguese have Angola and Mozambique. The Italians have some possessions. They get into the game late, and they don't have anything that's particularly valuable. Part of this is just the prestige of having a colony. And that applies to the Germans, who entered the colonial race late also, against the wishes of Otto von Bismarck, who said, we don't need colonies. We're the biggest power in Europe. This will do nothing for us other than perhaps get us in trouble with the British. And he was very far-sighted with that. But still, the Germans claim some colonies in Africa, and they'll also try and claim some possessions in the Pacific. Now, the strangest of all the countries that have a colonial possession is little tiny Belgium. And they will take over the Belgian Congo. Now, you have to remember, because of the distortion of putting, the globe on a flat surface, you can't quite see how huge the Congo is. It's gigantic. I think it's upwards of half the size of the continental United States. All right, I have to shift gears now and go to the slide file, so one quick moment. All right, sorry, this is going to be a little sloppy. All right, I'm going to spend time on what happens in the Congo as a kind of a case study that represents, to some extent, the kind of exploitation and the experiences that most of these colonies have at the hands of their European colonizers. But I have to stipulate, this is the worst. This is the worst case. So this is the story of Leopold II, this guy, Belgium, and the Congo. Now, the strangeness of this whole thing is that Belgium is a brand new country. It didn't even have an existence until the 1830s, when it was created as a French-speaking country in opposition to the Dutch. Holland, the Netherlands, is going to be the Protestant part of the Low Countries, as they once were termed, and Belgium is the Catholic, French-speaking part. Belgium will become a constitutional monarchy, and the king does not really have very much power. He's very much similar to the British monarch. He reigns, but he doesn't really rule. But he's a very strong and forceful personality. When he becomes the king of Belgium in 1865, he immediately says to his parliament, we should have a colony. Everybody else is getting a colony. Belgium needs a colony. And his parliament says, that's nuts. We don't need a colony. We're doing just fine. And it's true. Belgium is going to become amazingly advanced in terms of its industrialization. Even outside of the size of its size, it's going to be an industrial powerhouse. And indeed, it does not need to have a colony to enrich itself, but he has to have a colony. And when he looks at the globe, a lot of it's already been grabbed by some European power, but he sees that in Central Africa, nobody's taken that over yet, and he sees that as the likely place that he can have his colony. So he's going to have this very shrewd long-term plan on how to go about this. And he sets up an organization to civilize the peoples of the Congo River. And it's all done under the guise of this is idealism, we're going to bring civilization, we're going to try to eliminate the slave trade that may have vestiges that are still going. Whoops. Here we go. But this is all a sham. This organization does not have any goals such as that. It's merely a front for his attempt to personally seize this territory. And it's going to become his private colony, not even administered by the Belgian government. So he hires some explorers to go up the Congo River and start to negotiate treaties. Essentially, tribal leaders on the long length of the Congo River are persuaded to sign documents in exchange for some goods that cedes territories to this company that is the personal property of King Leopold. As many as 450 treaties are signed. And that's going to be his initial foothold in taking over the Congo. Eventually, his goal is to have this whole area declared as a sovereign state, an independent country, with, of course, himself as the monarch. This is the basic route of the explorer that he hired to go deep into the interior of Africa and negotiate all these sales, these land sales. Now, in 1885, there's something called the Berlin Conference. Otto von Bismarck, who by this time is the most powerful diplomat in Europe, he organizes this conference because he wants to head off any potential conflict. He wants no wars between European powers. And he feels that if everybody meets and they agree on who's got what, and they agree on boundaries, we won't have any conflicts. This is very much a bunch of Europeans gathering, staring at a map of Africa, and arbitrarily carving it up for themselves, drawing boundaries just because they want to draw boundaries in a certain area. The boundaries often pay no attention to cultures, to tribes, languages. So people in Africa will find themselves overnight now part of one new country which never existed before. And that's going to have such amazingly difficult long-term implications for when African countries become free and independent, trying to organize a nation state out of a chunk of territory, the boundaries of which were just arbitrarily drawn up by Europeans in the 1880s. Leopold's the big winner in this. The Berlin Conference basically says, yes, you got it. We give you our official approval. You have what is going to be called the Congo Free State. Now, for the next 23 years, Leopold, who's already a wealthy man, he's going to amass this incredibly huge fortune by exploiting the Congo directly and by allowing other private companies to do business there in exchange for giving half the profits to him. Much of the population of Congo is reduced to actual slavery. Leopold hires mercenaries, and they form an army that terrorizes the population into submission. This is called the force publique. Rubber has now become a very necessary commodity, and it's not just for tires, for bicycles or cars. Rubber's a key ingredient in industrial machinery. For gaskets and pulleys and things. Everybody's got to have rubber. Rubber is native to the Americas, but the rubber trees are brought into various parts of the world where the climate is okay for rubber trees. And rubber plantations are set up. Vast rubber plantations are set up in the Congo area. Now, the people that are working in these places, the conditions are horrible. They're underfed, they're overworked, And whenever they run away or they don't work hard enough, they have this incredibly savage way of punishing them. They chop off their hands. This is a very gruesome photo, but here's some guy holding human hands that have been cut off as punishment. Why would they do that? Well, it's one of these visible ways of terrorizing people into submission. You see somebody walking around with a hand cut off, that's a very vivid reminder of what can happen to you. It's more effective than killing the people and having them disappear. You maim them as a way of publicly showing who's in control. At one point, these soldiers, when they're sent after somebody and they have to shoot somebody, they're required to make sure they have a hand for every bullet that's fired. We have to economize. There's just horrible atrocities engaged in over the decades of Belgian rule in the Congo. Lots and lots of horrible atrocities. Villages burned, men, women, and children slaughtered or put into slavery. This particularly interesting person, this is Leon Rom, who was the head of the Force Publique. And he was famous for, in his office compounds, he had a fence around the perimeter of the area in which he had a head stuck on the slats of the fence. And he had a rockery, kind of a garden, that was filled with rotting heads. Look, I just have to mention quickly, the latest Tarzan movie, which maybe some of you have seen, they have an actor that the main villain in this movie is this guy, Leon Rom. And of course, Tarzan at the end of the movie destroys him and the Force Publique and the people of the Congo are free. Sorry, that never will happen. Now, eventually, news of what's going on in the Congo leaks out. Missionaries and other people begin to whisper, "Oh my God, this is a living hell in this place." And Leopold, again, he's shrewd as a fox. He organizes his own counter-intelligence, counter-media organizations. And he will invite people in to tour, carefully selected places where you can't see any atrocities, to show that, oh, we're doing this great job civilizing and everybody's happy. And it's, of course, a huge lie. This fellow is not very famous, but he ought to be. There ought to be statues of him somewhere. This is Edmund Morel, and he's just a British shipping clerk. But he becomes obsessed with the Congo and trying to dramatize what's happening and to organize opinion and action against it. He publishes a weekly newsletter that highlights all the stuff that's happening. And it has an effect. It doesn't have much effect, but it has some effect. By the time we get to 1908, the international outcry is so intense that the Belgian parliament, which is now embarrassed as the word gets out about what's happening in the Congo, they actually take over the Congo Free State and start to administer it directly as a colony. And Leopold is basically bought out, but he's given a huge amount of money for it. Now, absorb this figure. At the time of Leo starting to take over this colony, to the time that finally he is stripped of it, the population of the Congo is somewhere between 20 and 30 million at the outset, and then there's less than 9 million about 20, 30 years later. Even if you take this low figure, 20 million, that's 11 million people that have died. That's worse than Hitler. This guy deserves to be in the top tier of the world's worst villains, right up there with Hitler, Stalin, and many others. The Belgian parliament will never, the government of Belgium will never investigate this or say it's sorry or try to fix the abuses, nothing. There will never be anybody held to account for all of this that happened. Leopold dies in 1908, and I can't resist saying this. I don't know whether he would have been subject to eternal punishment, but if anybody deserved it, it would be this guy. Now, the political situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it is an independent country now, is still terrible. Even as I speak right now, there's an ongoing civil war that's been raging for many years, I think decades. It's still horrible. The abuses of this era are still being played out in a society that's not even close to having stable, prosperous democracy. So way to go, Leopold. Now, I did choose probably the worst example, but if you go to any other place, including India, including other colonial powers, I mean, to varying degrees, that's essentially the story. The entire idea of a colony is to squeeze money out of it for the mother country. And even if there is occasional benefits, such as rule of law, such as engineering, railroads, etc., that's rather strongly outweighed by the very negative effects of this long-term subjugation. When African countries become independent after World War II, to varying degrees, the mother country governments in all these colonies just take off. And then somehow these people are supposed to put together a functioning, stable nation. Well, good luck with that. And that's partially the answer as to why Africa is still a long way off from developing stable, prosperous countries that have free elections and they're not being exploited by horrible kleptocratic dictators. There's just a handful of countries that have achieved some degree of stability. They have a long, long way to go. All right, that's the lecture.